Yeah, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening if you're joining us from different time zone. I'm Aneta Piekut, one of the director for Migration Research Group, and together with my colleagues Majela Kiltke and Rebecca Murray, I would like to welcome you to the second seminar in this semester of our group. Today we will record only the presentation part of the session, so we'll encourage you to participate in a discussion later on. And the speaker today is Professor Matthew Bennett from University of Sheffield, who will be in a discussion with Professor Sarah Salway, also from our University of Sheffield. The topic of the seminar is very close also to my own research. We'll be discussing, the relationship between social diversity and we'll focus on well-being and health. And for myself, the interest on the topic of the social diversity effects started over a decade ago after there's been so much research following this famous Robert Putnam article on the eroding effect of diversity in the context of American communities and how is it negatively affecting trust of communities and social cohesion. And later on, as probably many of you know, this has been a little bit questioned in different countries and by applying different methods. And I think also as a follow-up to this research, people started exploring the effect of social diversity more broadly, like looking at the well-being and health and wider implications for communities. So it's great that we'll have a chance to sort of come back to this discussion and maybe also critically reflect on different sort of how it's this conversation around social diversity, how is it evolved, and what we've achieved. I think also how we improved this kind of a research. Professor Matthew Bennett, our colleague from the University of Sheffield, he's currently professorial research fellow in CIRCLE, which is a Center for International Research on Care, Labour and Equalities, but also he's embedded in sociological studies here in Sheffield. Matthew holds an associate position in Social School of Policy and Practice at the University of Pennsylvania, USA as well, where he's a co-director of the month-long Social Impact Fellowship. Matthew's research is on inequalities, well-being outcomes, care, pro-social behavior, and social diversity, and currently he's co-investigator on a few projects around this, and probably these projects will be discussed during the presentation, so I skip mentioning their titles. And Professor Sarah Salway is also a professor in sociological studies of public health, and I will introduce her a little bit later, but now I would like to give the virtual floor to Professor Matthew Bennett, who will speak for about 25-30 minutes, and after that we'll have a discussion and a chance for a speaker to reflect on the discussion points raised by Sarah. Right, everybody enjoy. It's nice to see so many familiar names in the audience. And Matthew, the microphone is yours for around 25-30 minutes.
Great, many thanks, Aneta. I'm just going to go ahead and share my slides. Can you see those, Aneta?
Yes, I can see them.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much, and thanks for that introduction, Aneta. I think that's a really useful framing of this work as well. As you can see from the list of people who are involved in this project, we're taking a very social psychological approach to the research question, and very sort of looking at it as using economic methods as well. So really looking forward to the discussion about what the strengths and weaknesses are of these approaches, how we can improve in the future, particularly because it's such an important topic that a number of us here are working on. So thanks very much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this discussion and talking with Sarah about it afterwards. This project, these two linked projects, really interested in the impact of social diversity on health and well-being, or the relationship between social diversity and health and well-being. In particular, thinking about how neighbourhoods change in terms of their social diversity, or how countries change in their social diversity, and what that means for how people interact with each other, and how that impacts on their health and well-being. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize as best I can. I wanted to give an overview, a summary of three papers that have resulted from these projects. I'm going to be doing a little bit of jumping about between the three projects. I hope it's not too confusing, and I hope that it enables you to see the sort of complementarity between the projects, and it sparks an interesting discussion at the conclusion. I should also say that two of these studies are international comparative studies, and one of them is focused on the UK. So as you know, globalization has and is still changing the ethnic and religious composition of our societies, and these changes have seen quite a lot of political appetite as well. So when we think about Brexit, or the election of Donald Trump, immigration and migration has featured very heavily in these debates. And so in the academic literature as well, there have been mixed findings on the impact of social diversity on various outcomes. Some studies find that there are negative impacts, so on things like economic performance, social capital, less school funding, more intergroup conflict, and lower levels of civic engagement. But in more recent studies, we found that a lot of these negative effects can be mitigated. So increasing ethnic diversity encourages intergroup contact and cooperation. Diversity experiences lead to more inclusive intergroup attitudes, and exposure to diversity leads to openness to multicultural experiences as well. And Annetta, really did a great job at summarising some of this literature at the outset. And I think we're going to be discussing some of this, perhaps at the end as well. That this literature is really, when you look at meta-analyses on this literature, or systematic reviews on this literature, some of these findings, or some of these mixed findings, stem from different units of analysis, different ways of measuring diversity, or operationalizing our outcome measures. And what we've tried to do in these sort of linked studies is be as consistent as we can, and take in all of those nuances when we're thinking of our modelling approach. And so I'll just give you an overview I'll give you an overview of the sort of theoretical framework that we're interested in. We're really interested in the time dynamic in this research question. So going back to the literature, a lot of this work has been cross-sectional. So we're really interested to know how social diversity impacts people over time. And so we were interested in thinking about evolutionary selective processes when we were theorizing about this work. And so to answer the question about how social diversity impacts on health and well-being, we drew on models of human evolution so that we could better understand how individuals react to these demographic changes. And this research in this area argues that as a result of evolutionary processes, humans have a predisposition to contrast in-groups and out-groups, so us and them. This process is adaptive, given that surviving is contingent upon the cooperation with other in-group members. And in addition, humans have evolved preferences for homogeneity and stability, and this is often called homophily in the literature. So regarding outgroups, the literature suggests that humans tend to approach outgroups with a certain degree of uncertainty. Unknown others could be friends or foes, prey or predators, etc. So caution needs to be taken when outgroups are approached. But on the other hand, we know that cooperation happens and is extended to outgroups all the time, and indeed biological and cultural anthropology contends that humans have evolved and fared better than other species because of contact with outgroups, and it brings a variety of benefits that cannot be attained by intragroup interactions alone. So for example, biological advantage in gaining genetic variability through new mating opportunities, individuals acquire more diverse resources and knowledge, and trust to and collaboration with outgroups largely outweigh the benefit and costs of intergroup conflict, contributing to the proliferation of group beneficial behaviours. So I'll just go to our first study, which is international comparison. I'm just going to describe some of the methodology that we use first and foremost before I get into a description of the findings. So in this study, we looked at 3 different data sets: so the World Value Survey, the European Social Survey, and the Latino Barometer. And if we had pulled this sample, they were all analysed individually, but if we had pulled this sample, we'd have had about 335,000 people over 20 years across 100 countries. So it gives us a broad brush picture of representative samples of people across a number of different cultures across quite an extensive time period. So the key variables that we were interested in were quality of life or well-being, and all of our measures across the studies, we used combined variables which took happiness, life satisfaction, self-reported health to create a single metric of quality of life or well-being. Our independent variable of interest is social diversity, and in this case it was religious diversity because we were constrained with some of our ethnicity measures in this comparative data set, and we used the Herfindahl index. We also used a number of other measures as robustness checks as well, and the results did not change. And I'm going to get into the nuances of the theoretical framework and our hypotheses a little bit later on, but a lot of these analyses involve mediation analyses. So we use structural equation modeling to understand the role of these mediators in the relationship between ethnic social diversity and quality of life or well-being. This study was a repeated cross-sectional analysis, so we used a multi-level framework and combined that with the structural equation modelling. So we have individuals nested in time points, nested in countries. There was a measurement component to the models as well, which I sort of alluded to with the quality of life outcome measure, but also one of our mediators had 3 questions on trust. And I've already alluded to there was a pathway component where we're interested in the mediators and the indirect effects between these variables. So here's just an overview of the findings at the outset. And this is using the Latino Barometer, but these findings were consistent across the surveys. What you see is across these different societies, increasing religious diversity was associated with poorer health and well-being, but these dissipated over time. So you can see in these 2 columns here, you have the period and the years, the gaps between the waves, and then we have the model coefficients which begin negatively, and they're statistically significant, suggesting that in the short term, in 2 years and 4 years, there are negative impacts of increasing diversity on well-being. As we move down that column, they become statistically insignificant and they sort of converge around a 0 towards the longer time period, so 12, 13, 14 years. So our idea, our hypothesis, is that these evolutionary tendencies are indeed not opposing, but they sort of develop at different rates. So in the short term, we're interested to know if there are preferences for in groups, and if those dissipate over time, and in the long term, out-group focused cognition and behaviour begin to emerge. And so to outline this in our modelling framework, we're interested in this diamond. We're interested to know if diversity is negatively related to trust in the first instance, which is what is responsible, which is negatively related to health and well-being. So this negative mechanism relates to the erosion of social cohesion and trust in others. But then we're interested in the long term, if diversity change encourages or promotes intergroup contact in the long term, which improves trust and therefore well-being and health in the long term. And this is indeed what we found. So this red pathway highlights these short-term effects. Our hypotheses were supported that in the short term there's this negative mechanism where there's erosion of social cohesion and trust in others. But in the long term, our hypotheses were also confirmed. So diversity change improved chances of intergroup contact, which improved trust and well-being outcomes. And those negative impacts were completely counteracted, those initial negative effects. So that leads us on to our second study, which was a longitudinal panel study in England. And this study utilised data from the British Household Panel Survey and the Standing Society. So we had a panel of respondents from 2004 to 2011, and that constituted 47,000 people living in just over 15,000 neighbourhoods. And the neighbourhood in this context is the lower super output area. And I should also say, as with the previous study, that there are various background and contextual level controls that are included in these models to account for as many sort of theoretical explanations and confounders as possible. So the contextual information that we had at the LSO level, our key variables were ethnic heterogeneity, again the Herfindahl index, which we got from the new FPOP project, and the index of multiple deprivation as well. We have our well-being and health measures, composite well-being score. So we had overall life satisfaction, general health, and GHQ, which was again combined into a single measure. And then we had for an objective measure of health, we used allostatic load. So we're really fortunate in the UK that a number of our social surveys collect biological information about the respondents, and all these data sources, I should also add, are publicly available for anyone who wants to use them for research purposes. So a really valuable opportunity to look at the interaction between the social and the biological in this context. Just to really describe what allostatic load is and how we operationalized it in our data. Again, we use multiple measures of allostatic load to check the robustness of our findings, but we use 12 biological analytes which capture cardiovascular, metabolic, neuroendocrine and immune biomarkers, and then one anthropometric measure. We created a 12-point index where clinical cut points were used for each analyte, capturing chronic stress and poor health, and respondents received a 1 if the clinical cut point is reached, or 0 if the cut point was not reached. So scores were then summed across the 12 analytes. And the allostatic load is really a measure of physiological wear and tear that the body is exposed to. So in terms of social diversity, we would argue based on the framework that it may result in systematic stress, so things like the release of cortisol as part of the stress response of the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, pro-inflammatory cytokines such as IL-6, and inflammatory biomarkers such as C-reactive protein and fibrinogen. And here you can just see it's a table just summarizing the type of biomarker that we used on the far left. The biomarker itself that constituted the type then the application of each of those biomarkers and what it's associated with. So for example, CRP, C-reactive protein, is an indicator of inflammatory load, and the cut point that we used was values over 3 milligrams per litre. And so here are our findings here of our results. On the left-hand side, we can see short-term ethnic diversity effects, and then long-term ethnic diversity effects. And then we have subjective well-being measures represented by the blue dot, and our stress levels or allostatic load was measured by the is represented, sorry, by the yellow dot. The first thing to notice in the short-term diversity results is that allostatic load was not associated with diversity at all, but short term there was a subjective well-being deficit, so there was a negative relationship between ethnic diversity and well-being. So ethnic diversity was associated with poorer levels of subjective well-being and health, but long term we see that these disappear. So this red line represents no effect. You can see that the confidence intervals overlap for both subjective well-being and health and stress levels for the long-term ethnic diversity, so indicating that there were no impacts of on health and well-being. And then we look to see how these results panned out over time. So we looked at the effect of change in diversity on well-being and health, and you can see that in the short term, indicated by the years at the bottom, it looked like there was a negative effect, but as time moved on, we see that the bars moved closer and closer to the 0 line until there was no significant effect long term. Which brings us to study 3, which was an international comparative study that focused on changes in countries' immigration levels and the impact on ethnic minority groups in particular. So just as a bit of context, in 2018 there were 21.8 million non-EU citizens living in the EU, EU 27 countries. And in a survey conducted in that same year, respondents said that immigration, or they cited immigration as the second most important issue facing the EU today. So what are the consequences of these changes for individuals, and in particular for minority groups? As you've seen in the work that I've just presented, most of the previous work in this area focuses on majority groups. So studies, there's been a proliferation ever since Putnam's famous 2007 paper. There have been some studies that have looked at the impacts of diversity and well-being, but the ethnic minority groups are often ignored in these studies, usually through restrictions in sample size. So what might we expect then short term and in terms of the effects of immigration? Well, we've already seen and some of the literature has highlighted that the white majority groups have increased perceived threats, lower levels of trust and well-being, out-group aversion, and voting for right-wing political parties. So we might expect that the ethnic minority groups might respond with more perceived, by experiencing more perceived discrimination or real discrimination, which may also result in less trust and lower levels of well-being as well. But based on the theoretical framework, long term, we would expect there to be more intergroup contacts and trust. But for the whitey groups, ethnic diversity helps to break down stereotypes, and initial negative effects on well-being are fully mitigated. So we would see that in the longer term that there would be less discrimination and more trust from the perspective of the ethnic minority groups. So here we used the European Social Survey, where we had 7 waves, and we had just over 5,000 self-identified ethnic minority group members living in 24 European countries. Again, we used a similar approach to the first international comparative study, where we had repeated cross sections, and we applied this multi-level structural equation modelling framework. We had measures of perceived discrimination, some of yes answers to being discriminated against because of colour or race, religion or ethnic group. We had a measure of generalised trust. Do you think that most people would try to take advantage of you if you got the chance, if they got the chance, or would they try to be fair? Our wellbeing measures were a composite score of happiness and life satisfaction, and then we had a range of country and individual level controls in those models as well. In terms of our country level models, we had immigration flow from Eurostat, so the number of incoming migrants. At the country level controls, we had GDP, social inequalities, population size, and then the migrant integration policy index. And these are the results. So in the short term, we saw that immigration did lead to more perceived discrimination, which resulted in negative or lower levels of trust, then impacted on negatively on well-being. So that short-term, similar sort of short-term effects were seen here in this model for these questions as well. But longer term, we saw that there was actually that perceived discrimination was reduced, and that generalized trust increased, and that resulted in more or increased well-being for this for minorities across these countries. So in short, or in conclusion, in the short term, we see that contextual level diversity was, as it increases, it's associated with individual level well-being and health, which decreases. The association dissipates, seems to dissipate over time, where individuals gradually adapt to diversity to their initial reluctance. Intergroup contact is a key mediator that reverses initial negative pathways. And well-being and adaptation among both minority and majority groups are closely intertwined. And I think that these are some important things to think about when we sort of think about these processes over time. You know, anti-immigration narratives will be particularly powerful, given that they will trigger some of these more basic, short-term negative pathways. And we can, you know, as a society, we need to think more carefully about immigration policies to ensure that there are opportunities for contact and thriving, where individuals are where these negative short-term pathways where they can be mitigated as early or removed as soon as possible. Great, and that's the end of the presentation. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Matthew. I think it was also an excellent example how research is a sort of a never-ending, that one piece of research leads always to the next one, and you know, develops more questions to be explored. And this was a fantastic example of this, how we do our research.